Hello, 8 Green students. Today we are going to talk about compromises at the Constitutional Convention as well as the ratification process. So the other day we learned about the Great Compromise. This was the most important compromise there. The Great Compromise essentially created our structure of government with our three branches. We have the legislative branch, which is also known as Congress. Within Congress, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives, the upper house and the lower house. We have the executive branch, which is ran by the president, as well as his cabinet members. The executive branch carries out and enforces the laws. Then we have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And this branch of government interprets laws and punishes lawbreakers. The national court system would help enforce those laws passed by the new national government. So this was the Great Compromise. It was presented at the Constitutional Convention by Roger Sherman, a guy from Connecticut. However, all of these ideas are basically James Madison's ideas, but the information needed to come from somebody else. The small states at the convention were not happy with Virginia being one of the big wealthy states, so it really needed to be presented by a guy outside of Virginia. So that's why they picked Roger Sherman from Connecticut, a tiny state. But ultimately, this was all James Madison's ideas. Some other compromises that happened. So the 3/5 compromise is one of the most bizarre and sad decisions that our government made. And it deals with how to count slaves in a state's population during this time period. So 90% of all African Americans in the South were slaves. That's about 700,000 of them. Now, Southerners wanted their slaves to be counted in their population total. Because remember, the more people you have in your state, the more votes in the lower house of Congress that you get, the House of Representatives. So Southerners were trying to pad their population totals in order to increase their votes in the House of Representatives. Northerners, of course, thought this was ridiculous that you would count slaves in their population total because the Southerners did not treat slaves as people. They treated them as property. So just like you wouldn't count any other types of property, the Northerners basically said that Southerners should not be counting their slaves. So they had to come to a compromise because they were kind of at a stalemate. The Southerners weren't budging, the Northerners weren't budging. Ultimately, a compromise came up that's known today as the 3/5 compromise. And basically what it said is they would count, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person in the population total. And so if you look at this graphic, basically for every 5 white people or free people in the South, you get 5. For every 5 enslaved persons, you would only count that as 3. So that's another way to look at it. So basically it's the 3/5 compromise allowed Southerners to count 3/5 of their slave population in each state, which did increase their voting power in the House of Representatives. Now, this law in this part of the government no longer exists. Once we outlawed slavery with the 13th Amendment after the Civil War, that effectively eliminated the 3/5 compromise as well. Another compromise that dealt with the slave trade. So some Northern delegates wanted the new Constitution to ban the importation of African slaves. Not stop slavery itself, but stop the Middle Passage, basically. This was a way to try to slow down the institution of slavery. Southern delegates basically threatened to leave the Union and form their own country if anything was done with the importation of slaves from Africa. So again, a compromise needed to be made between northern states and southern states. So the compromise said this: for the next 20 years, the federal government would not interfere with the slave trade. So from 1787 until 1807, the slave trade was basically off limits. Nothing was going to, be done to stop that. But in the meantime, slaveholders would be taxed up to $10 per slave that they purchased. So not only are you're paying for the slave at the auction, but then the federal government was going to tax you on that. And that's roughly $275 today per slave. So the federal government is getting tax dollars off of this. The southern states are basically being left alone to continue their slave trade. So that's the compromise. We will talk about what happens when 1807 hits. We'll talk about that in a later chapter. All right, the executive compromise. So the chief executive, the executive branch, the different one. The executive branch, yes. So the chief executive, our president, basically was going to be voted on and elected by the people, okay? However, early on, you have to remember this is the 1780s. Not everybody went to school. Not everybody was educated in politics. There was no internet. There was no TV, no radio. Basically, you had newspapers. So for the people to know about the candidates that were running for office, it was very difficult. They're just lack of education, lack of information, and the media. So they created something called the Electoral College. Now, we're living in a time right now where we're in the midst of a presidential election, and there's still some debate on that election. And what everybody's looking at is not the popular vote, okay, but the electoral vote and which candidate won the correct number of states, okay? So right now, Joe Biden has won the popular vote, and he won the popular vote in enough states to win the Electoral College. And we talked about this, back during the election process with, looking for 270 votes to win, 270 electoral votes. So the Electoral College was put in place because they just didn't trust that the general public would have the knowledge base to decide between two candidates. So they basically created these special electors, these qualified voters from each state to make up the Electoral College. So even though I went and voted for president and I made my vote known, my vote counted, but not necessarily in a popular vote way, okay? My vote counted, but my state electors are going to look at how people voted in Missouri and then base their electoral votes on that. And each state has the same number of votes in the Electoral College as what they have in Congress. So that's the Electoral College. It's controversial, okay? Some people say that it's outdated. Other people say that it still has a lot of validity and it allows every state to be involved in the process and these smaller states not get pushed around by the bigger states. Let's be honest, would we be talking about Arizona and Nevada if it wasn't for the Electoral College? I don't know that those states would register on our radar, maybe not even Georgia. So there's some small to medium-sized states that are in play right now with this most recent election. So there you go. There's the Electoral College. And also part of that executive compromise, they did decide to have a new election every 4 years. So this would prevent the president from becoming too powerful or abusing his power. And there isn't, at the time, there was no limit. You could run as many times as you wanted. Today, we have a term limit. You can only run for president for 2 terms. But that didn't exist until the mid-1900s. We'll talk about that later in the year. But the current president could run for re-election if he or she chose to. And we'll talk about qualifications for president in the next chapter. Some other decisions that were made. The power to declare war on another nation was given to Congress, not the president. Many people think that the president has the power to declare war, and that is not accurate. Congress has to do the official declaration of war, and the idea is you don't want to give the power to declare war to just one person, okay? So they leave it to Congress. Now, the president can ask for a declaration of war. The president can ask for a declaration of war, but Congress has to officially approve that. There are no religious requirements to hold public office. That was a decision that was made. They did away with all requirements of being a Christian to hold any kind of public office. And the United States would create a standing army to help defend itself against enemy invasion. We were dealing with issues with Spain, with England, with the Barbary states over in North Africa. And so it was time to create a standing army, a national military, and along with that, we'll also be creating a national navy to help us on the high seas. All right, that is our discussion as far as other compromises. So we reviewed the Great Compromise, establishing the structure of our government, the 3/5 Compromise, the Executive Compromise, which led to the Electoral College, and then some other decisions that were made as well. Thanks for watching.